good evening. It is my privilege to welcome all of you here and to welcome before us the two persons who will be taking part in this two-part lecture conversation on the subject of anti-Semitism, its history, its roots, and also its present manifestations in our community and in our world. The first of these tonight here at Rolling Hills United Methodist Church. The second will be a week from Thursday at St. Francis Episcopal Church in Palos Verdes Estates. We are glad that you are here, and I want to say a couple of words about the folks who are sharing in the presentation tonight. Father Alexi Smith is the Ecumenical and Interreligious Officer of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles, the position he has held since appointed by Cardinal Roger Mahony in 2000. A graduate of the University of Southern California, he was awarded a Master of Divinity from Holy Cross Greek Catholic School of Theology and ordained a Greek Catholic priest of the Eparchy of Newton, Massachusetts. He is the pastor of St. Andrew Russian Greek Catholic Church in El Segundo and leads St. Paul Melkite Greek Catholic Mission, both actually located in El Segundo. He is known throughout the area for his dedicated work as a leader of interfaith relations of the Archdiocese. Among other events, he has led a Buddhist delegation to the Vatican, serves on the Rabbi Priest Committee, and is the coordinator of the Western Region's Catholic-Muslim Dialogue for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Father Alexi has been invested as a Knight Commander of the Equestrian Order of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. He served as president of the Interreligious Council of Southern California for 5 years and is the recipient of numerous commendations and awards. He is well known in our community for his appearances on the Dawn Unity Interfaith Discovery panels and his advisory role with the South Bay Catholic Jewish Women's Conference. He teaches at Mount St. Mary's and at Loyola Marymount University. We are grateful to have him with us this evening. Bob Rothman is known to many as the principal founder and convener of the Dawn Unity Interfaith Series, which began its 22nd year of interreligious dialogue on the peninsula last month. He is the former president of Congregation Ner Tamid, the conservative synagogue in our community, which shared facilities with this congregation in the 1970s for some 7 years. In addition to his work with Dawn Unity, Bob continues exploring issues of Jewish-Christian relations through graduate and undergraduate courses at Long Beach State and at Loyola Marymount. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for your leadership and care.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I'd like to begin with a prayer, the prayer that Pope St. John Paul II placed in the Kotel, the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, during his historic visit there. The prayer reads as follows: God of our fathers, you chose Abraham and his descendants to bring your name to the nations. We are deeply saddened by the behavior of those who in the course of history have caused these children of yours to suffer. Asking your forgiveness, we wish to commit ourselves to genuine brotherhood with the people of the covenant, and we ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the prophecy of Isaiah, chapter 56, we read these words: I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name. Monument and a name, in Hebrew, I believe, is Yad Vashem. Ever been there? Yeah, good. Yad Vashem is the Jewish people's living memorial to the Holocaust in Jerusalem, safeguarding the memory of the past and imparting its meaning for future generations. Both multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, It presents the story of the Shoah from a uniquely Jewish point of view, emphasizing the experiences of the individual victims through original artifacts, survivor testimonies, and personal possessions. I personally have been there many times. I'm often part of official delegations from the Archdiocese to what we term the Holy Land. And I also co-teach, as Jonathan referred to, I co-teach a course at Loyola Marymount University every other year through the Jewish Studies program there entitled Literature and Faith in the Holy Land, where we take students from the university and we explore the Holy Land through the lenses of Jewish literature, which one of the professors from LMU teaches, and faith, which Rabbi Mark Diamond and I then teach. Every year at this trip, during this class, we go to Yad Vashem. And I always warn the students prior to entering that museum that what they're about to experience would not be easy and would not leave them unmoved. And my warning has often proved true. I remember one young man, this big, bulky guy, who left the museum and sat outside in the courtyard in tears for a great period of time afterwards. And when I inquired as to what was causing this, what evoked and caused these tears to flow, he said, "Because, Father, I was once a skinhead, and I hated the Jews. And much of what I did is reflected in this museum." Sadly, that young man, I learned later, went on and committed suicide because he couldn't live with everything that he had done in the past. On my first visit to Yad Vashem many years ago now, I was part of this official delegation from Los Angeles. We visited both the Vatican and Jerusalem. And the delegation was composed of Jews, our fellow Christians, and one very brave Muslim woman. When we entered the museum, some of the artifacts glared at me, particularly some of the photographs of priests and bishops giving the Nazi salute. Another photograph documented a priest standing next to a Jewish woman who was being obviously harangued by what looked like members of the Gestapo. The Jewish woman was looking up forlornly at the priest, as if begging him to do something, to intercede on her behalf. Apparently, he did nothing. But perhaps the most challenging experience I encountered that first time there was when a young docent observed me at the section of photographs about Pius XII, Pope Pius XII, the Pope at the time of the Holocaust. The docent came up to me, dressed as I am in my ecclesial finery here, and he looked at me very adversarially in the eye and said, "You people and your Pope did nothing to help us." And then he continued to harangue me and the Catholic Church. I tried to be respectful, tried to listen to him, tried to offer some examples of righteous Catholic Gentiles. He was having none of it. He demanded that I, as if I had the power to do so, open the Vatican archives so that the real story, in his words, about Pius XII's Holocaust collaboration could become known. Collaboration, I asked? Yes, he said. That's our position, and we're sticking to it until you prove otherwise. Well, those Vatican archives have subsequently been opened, but Pius XII remains a very controversial figure. So how did the Catholic Church, and through the Catholic Church much of Christianity then, come to be seen as a collaborator in the Holocaust? I think initially, the differences between those who believed in Jesus and those who did not follow his teaching involved an argument within Judaism about the right way to read the Torah, the right way to read the events through the lenses of the Torah. Though the rhetoric could often be caustic, as in some of the Gospels, Matthew chapter 23, for example, where Matthew writes, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites," and such words. I think it reflected the passion of a family argument, analogous to the controversies that flare up often within denominations today. You're no stranger to that. The movement from fraternal twin to rivals signals a significant shift in which criticism and polemic moved from the realm of intra-Jewish debate to that of Christian versus Jew. As Gentiles came to predominate the believers in Jesus, the differentiation moved outside a family circle, and increasingly the word Christian stood for opposition to Judaism. The critique of Judaism found in the educated elite of Christianity in early antiquity bore the marks of Greco-Roman polemical style, most notably the art of defaming the other, and the perspectives of an insecure religious minority. Christians saw themselves as rivals to the Jews, a polarity that certainly would have seemed strange to Jesus because he, of course, was himself a Jew. This division between these fraternal twins happened neither quickly nor uniformly. Moreover, I don't think there was a single issue that it could be identified as the cause of this separation. Rabbi David Klinghoffer, some years ago, wrote a book entitled Why the Jews Rejected Jesus, and in that he maintains that the Jews rejected Jesus because Jesus didn't advocate following all the 313 commandments. I don't know about that. I don't know. At least until the mid-2nd century, and in many places well past that, the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity were not so firm as we might have imagined. This seems particularly true among ordinary people, those neither in religious leadership nor among the literary elite. Presumably, they had less interest in the theological distinctions being made by their leaders. An author by the name of John Cager, in his article, The Parting of the Ways, A View from Early Christianity, writes, for many Christians, there was no break at all with Judaism, not in the year 70, not in the year 150, not indeed until the year 370, some 300 years after virtually all previous scholars have told us that the final break took place. Not so sure I agree with all of that, although if you look at the writings of a Spanish nun by the name of Egeria, who made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in about the year 381, she writes about Jews and Christians living very harmoniously together in Capernaum in Galilee, which was the headquarters, if you will, of Jesus during his ministry in Galilee. The division, however, deepened in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Much of Christian literature in the late 2nd through 5th centuries centered on apologetics, that is, explaining and justifying our beliefs. Christians had, for example, to vindicate their decision to retain the Hebrew Scriptures as what we term the Old Testament. Marcion had proposed that it be jettisoned altogether. Christians proclaimed the radical newness of Christianity. So teachers of an earlier era, such as Barnabas, who died in the year 97, Justin, the philosopher and martyr, who died in the year 165, Tertullian died in 225, Origen 254, they all argued, often vehemently, that Jews misinterpreted the Scriptures. Only Christians, they maintained, rightly read the prophecies. Only Christians worshiped in the true ways. The Jews, blind to God's ways and lacking in faith, were mired in the law. They were rivals indeed. I'd like to share with you now a sample of some of the early church fathers' writings regarding the Jews. I warn you in advance, these are not pleasant to hear. St. Gregory of Nyssa, for example, who died in 350. Jews are slayers of the Lord, murderers of the prophets, enemies of God, haters of God, adversaries of grace, enemies of their fathers' faith. Here he's laying the foundation for the accusation of deicide against the Jews. That is, that they were Christ killers. Augustine of Hippo, who died in 400, the Jews held him The Jews insulted him. The Jews bound him. They crowned him with thorns. They dishonored him by spitting on him. They scourged him. They heaped abuses on him. They hung him on a tree. They pierced his side with a lance. Again, the charge of deicide. In another place he writes, the church admits and avows the Jewish people to be cursed because after killing Christ, they continue to till the ground of an earthly circumcision, an earthly Sabbath, an earthly Passover. In this way, the Jewish people, like Cain, continue tilling the ground in the carnal observance of the law, which does not yield to them its strength, because they do not perceive in it the grace of Christ. Here again, we have the foundation of that idea of the wandering Jew, that the Jews were kept alive as a permanent reminder that Christianity now had replaced Judaism. Hence the idea of the wandering Jew and the whole idea of supersessionism, Christianity superseding Judaism. A couple of others. John Chrysostom. Do not be surprised if I've called the Jews wretched. They are truly wretched and miserable. They have received many good things from God, yet they have spurned them and violently cast them away. The Son of Righteousness rose on them first, but they turned their back on its beams and sat in darkness. But we, who were nurtured in darkness, welcomed the light and were freed from the yoke of error. The Jews were branches of that holy root, but they were lopped off. We were not part of the root, yet we have produced the fruits of piety. They read the prophets from ancient time, that they crucified the one spoke of by the prophets. They were called to sonship, yet they degenerated to the level of dogs. Dogs here certainly not as the pets we have today. I'd like to call particular attention to Melito of Sardis, whom I discovered some years ago while I actually was in Turkey. I visited Sardis. Sardis is in today's Turkey. Sardis had a very large Jewish community at one point, dating from at least the 3rd century before the Common Era. And in Melito's time, he died in the year 180, they likely constituted about 10% of the population. They had an impressive synagogue. I walked on the beautiful floor that still exists of the synagogue and touched what's left of the walls of the synagogue, which I discovered, on which I discovered a plaque saying that they were partially restored by Wilshire Boulevard Temple here in Los Angeles. They had a massive gymnasium also, constructed in the year 17 before the Common Era. Both the archaeological and documentary evidence suggest that the Jewish community here was very influential. In contrast, there is absolutely no evidence that the Christian community held a similar status. Melito seems to have been preaching to a fledgling Christian community, a group living under the shadow of a venerable and well-established, attractive Jewish community. Melito, however, paints a very different picture. Melito's defensiveness arises not only from the fact that Christians lived under the shadow of the Jewish community. At Sardis, Judaism itself, he said, possessed a threat. Simply by existing, and especially by flourishing, Judaism implicitly questioned the central claims of Christianity. So I reacquainted myself with some of his writings, recalling his famous sermon entitled Homily on the Passover, a brilliant, poetic presentation of Jesus in the imagery of the Passover. Melito's basic tool is typology, the use of persons, situations, and events from the past to throw light on a present experience. You know that in the 12th chapter of the book of Exodus, the account of the Passover, that serves as the biblical text for his sermon. Melito, however, reads it in light of the Christ event, offering a Christian lens on all the great ancestors of faith. In the third section of his sermon, he takes up the responsibility for Jesus' death, and with considerable rhetorical flourish, he lodges this accusation: "O wicked Israel, why did you carry out his flesh? Deed of injustice brings new sufferings upon your Lord, your Master, your Creator, your Maker, the one who honored you, you who called you Israel. But you were discovered not to be Israel, for you have not seen God or acknowledged the Lord. Bitter for you, the nails which you sharpened. Bitter for you, the tongue which you sharpened. Bitter for you, the false witness which you set up. Bitter for you, the bonds which you prepared. Bitter for you, the whips which you plaited. Bitter for you, Judas, whom you rewarded. Bitter for you, Herod, whom you obeyed. Bitter for you, Caiaphas, and whom you trusted. Bitter for you, the gall which you furnished. Bitter for you, the thorns which you gathered. Bitter for you, the hands which you stained with blood. You put to death your Lord in the midst of Jerusalem." Even a reader 2,000 years later can feel the tension mounting as Melito reaches a climax with his plaintive question: and who has been killed? And who is the killer? Who has been killed is Christ. Who is the killer? The Jews. It's this disturbing claim that made Melito infamous as the first poet of the deicide. This charge of deicide: by crucifying Jesus, the Jews had murdered God, would be hurled with impunity, with dreadful repercussions on the Jews from the Middle Ages and a bit before and well beyond. This negative role of the Jews is often sadly portrayed, or was sadly often portrayed, in passion plays, as plays that depict the passion and death of Christ during the Christian Holy Week. Often also evident in European art. I don't know how many of you have visited European cathedrals, but these places are known to display teachings of contempt and theological denial of Judaism, proclaiming Jews as the killers of Christ. In Italy, for example, in the church of Urbino, a woman is shown stealing the host and handing it over to a Jewish pawnbroker for destruction. They are discovered, they're burned at the stake. In classic Spanish literature, Las Cantigas de Santa Maria, a compilation of poetry and music by King Alfonso X of Castile, there are 6 pictures illustrating the legend about the theft by a Jew under the inspiration of the devil of a picture of the Virgin Mary. Christian wife and his husband and wife find this picture and claim it and honor it. Leading up to the Middle Ages, a new pattern of institutional discrimination against the Jews occurred. Jews were forbidden to intermarry with Christians. They were forbidden from high positions in the government. They were prevented from appearing as witnesses against Christians in the trials. And as Jews were being officially ostracized, certain bizarre fantasies about them arose in Northern Europe that foreshadowed the anti-Semitism of our century. By this time, it was alleged that Jews had horns and tails and engaged in ritual murder of Christians, for example, to make the matzah for Passover. This latter allegation, referred to as the blood libel, was fabricated by a person by the name of Thomas of Maynooth in 1150 to explain the mysterious death of a Christian boy. And it reoccurs in many English and German myths. In the year 1095, Pope Urban II made a general appeal to the Christians of Europe to take up the cross and the sword and liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims, beginning what was to be known as the Crusades. That religious fervor that drove them, and men and later even children, on the Crusades, was to have direct consequences for the Jews. The Crusader armies, which more closely resembled mobs, swept through Jewish communities, looting, raping, massacring the inhabitants. Thus, the pogrom, the organized massacre of Jews, was born. Another couple of examples of church architecture and art. In the Cathedral of Strasbourg in France, in 1230, there's a statue entitled Ecclesia e Synagoga, Church versus Synagogue. The synagogue is a blindfolded woman, her staff broken, and she holds tablets of the law which are upside down. The church, on the other hand, has a crowned young woman with a cross and a chalice, triumphant. Stained glass from a window in the church of Würburg in Germany, dating from 1467. Again, we find the church versus synagogue. The church is portrayed as a king riding on a lion. The synagogue is a blindfolded woman, the staff broken, the crown sliding off her head. Also, in the Liege Psalm book, printed in Belgium, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who condemned Jesus to death, is pictured as a Jew washing his hands of the crime. Pontius Pilate was a Roman pagan governor. He was not Jewish. During the middle 14th century, of course, the bubonic plague spread through Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population. It was all blamed on the Jews. In 1290, King Edward I expelled the Jews from England, making England the first European country to do so. Over 200 years later, on the 30th of July, 1492, the Jewish community of Spain, who had lived peacefully in Spain for centuries before Spain adopted the Christian faith, some 200,000 people at the time, all of them were expelled by edicts issued by their Catholic majesties, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. This was certainly part of the larger Spanish Inquisition, which was carried out in part to convert the Jews to Catholicism. A considerable number of Jews, men, women, and children, were mistreated or died as a result of the Inquisition. In 1475, the body of Simon of Trent was found by a member of the local Jewish community. The Jewish community was blamed for murdering him, again to obtain his blood for some type of ritual purposes. During the Middle Ages, hundreds of such false accusations of ritual murder and host desecration were made against the Jewish communities throughout Europe. Though often supported by the local clergy, in the case of Simon, the Bishop of Trent actually tried to support the Jews here, but the people were not accepted. These charges were regularly denied and condemned by subsequent popes over the centuries, but still were accepted by many individuals. What makes all these entirely false accusations against the Jews over the centuries pertinent to our discussion about anti-Semitism is what seems to have been a popular level reflex of that ancient Christian canard that Jews were collectively responsible for the death of Jesus. The deicide charge, carried forward over the ages and embroidered over the centuries, as we've seen by the blood libel charges and increasingly vindictive passion plays depicting the Jews as being in league with the devil, can truly be said to have paved the way for the Holocaust. A writer by the name of Ben Simon Boker put it so trenchantly in his book, Judaism and Christianity, Judaism and the Christian Predicament. He put it in these words: "The conception of the Jew as a sinister figure, accentuated by hate, to seek the death of Jesus, invited the belief that these characteristics were a permanent trait of the Jew, and that he is continually engaged in secret plots against Christians. The Jews then became a frequent target of all charges of all sorts of nefarious activities against their Christian neighbors. Throughout the Middle Ages, one continues to encounter various libels against the Jews, that they poisoned wells, that they desecrated the wafer used as the host in the Christian Mass, that they slew Christians, especially Christian children, used their blood for ritual purposes. Torture produced confessions from those accused, and one such libel became evidence for the perpetuation of yet another libel." In 1545, Martin Luther, the great reformer, wrote a pamphlet entitled the Jews and their lies, claiming that the Jews thirsted for Christian blood and urged the slaying of Jews. The Nazis reprinted that pamphlet in 1935. Some scholars feel that these scurrilous attacks marked the transition from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism. A couple of other facts. Certainly Jews were required to wear distinctive clothing by their Christian overlords. Pope Gregory IX pressed the ecclesiastical and secular authorities alike to seize and destroy Jewish books. King Louis IX heeded this order, seizing them in 1240. Shortly after that, the copies of the Talmud were condemned and burned in Paris in 1242 and 1244, an action that certainly foreshadows the Inquisition's condemnation and public burning of the Talmud in Rome in 1553, and much later, of course, Kristallnacht. There are many other foreshadowings we could discuss, but I think you get the picture. I began with a prayer, that of John Paul II at the Kotel, the Western Wall in Jerusalem, showing where we've come. I would like to close, and then after Bob speaks, entertain any questions you might have, with a prayer showing from whence we came in terms of the Catholic Church's mentality towards the Jews. I don't know how many of you are Catholic. If you are, and you are of my vintage, you will remember the old prayer and the old Good Friday liturgy, the prayer for the conversion of the Jews. That prayer read, "Let us also pray for the Jews, that the Lord our God may take the veil from their hearts, that they may also acknowledge our Lord Jesus Christ. Let us pray, Almighty and everlasting God, you who don't refuse your mercy even to the Jews, hear the prayers which you offer for the blindness of that people, so that they may acknowledge the light of your truth and be delivered from their darkness." A friend of mine used to work at the Vatican, and when Pope John the 23rd was, shortly after he was elected, he was celebrating his first Holy Week as our Pope, and I'm told that on Good Friday, before the service began, he asked the Monsignori, the assistants, to bring in a copy of the service book. He wanted to look at the service book. So they brought in the service book, and he went to where this prayer was indicated, and then he asked for a pen. Well, that really shook up the Monsignori. What's he going to do? So he took the pen, and he put a great X through this prayer. And he uttered the words, basta, which in Italian means enough. Enough of this mentality. And he subsequently then summoned the Second Vatican Council, which subsequently totally reversed Catholic thinking and actions and activities with the Jewish people. And that's what we'll look at next week. Thank you for having me.
When all is finished, when we finish tonight and we finish next week, I want you to take away two important realizations. I want you, first of all, to realize anti-Semitism is 2,000 years old. It is called the world's oldest and longest hatred. It did not just happen today. There's been a continuum, and Jews have been oppressed for that time somewhere in the world, not everywhere. The second thing I want you to understand is the personal nature of Jewish history to Jews today. I had a man work for me once upon a time named Marat Kolchinsky. Marat was my age. He came from Kiev. He had been to the university and studied metallurgy. He was working in a factory in Kiev putting out turbine engine parts. I have a degree in metallurgy. I was working in a company restoring turbine engine parts. I was the same age. My grandfather was born in Kiev, but he left. And Murat and I used to say to each other, if his grandfather had left and my grandfather would have stayed, our roles would have been reversed. My maternal grandfather was born one of 8 children in Białystok, Poland. He and his brother came to the U.S. His 6 siblings were murdered at Auschwitz. It could have been me, just that simple. If my grandfather had stayed and somebody else had come, and this is the way Jews look at their history, and you need to understand this makes it a personal thing, always. Now, going to the history, there was no place for Jews in feudal Christian society. Forbidden to own land or belong to craftsmen's guilds, refused citizenship, could not be men in arms because those were soldiers for Christ, unable to be lawyers, physicians, and other educated people because universities were closed to them. So they turned to money lending as one thing, because Christians were forbidden to be money lenders unless you did it on a grand scale like the Medicis, then it was okay. But if you loan to your neighbor, no, you can't do that. So the area was open for Jews. It's one of the few things that they could do. Jews were also good as traders. They were educated in their religion, had some formal education. They had a common language throughout the world. They had a common culture throughout the world. They were able to deal with Muslims, with Christian merchants had problems with. They knew the Arabic counting system, which was so much better than the Roman numerals at that time. And they spoke the languages that were necessary to do, so they became very good at traders. The Lateran Council, meeting in 1215, issued Canon 69, which forbade that Jews be allowed in public office, since this offers them the pretense to vent their wrath against the Christians. It would be too absurd for a blasphemer of Christ to exercise power over Christians. Crusades were the first time the Jews were murdered because they were Jews. They had been discriminated against, but not murdered. The Crusades were, of course, launched to return control of the Holy Land, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and all to Christian control, take it away from the Muslims who then controlled it. In preparing for this, there was a gathering at Rouen in the spring of 1095 when hell began for the Jews of Europe. But we have before our eyes certain Jews, a race more abhorrent to God than any other. The crusade was against infidels, so why not begin with the Jews who were there and helpless? Jews had lived in the Rhine Valley since Roman times. Yes, they were discriminated against, but they lived. They didn't live in physical fear. Then the Crusades changed everything. They were made to choose between conversion and death. Most of them chose death, in what was called Kaddish Hashem, the sanctification of the name of God. These pogroms began in Speer in 1096, Worms, where 500 Jews were killed, Mainz, where 1,300 were killed, Cologne, Metz, Regensburg. At Trier, Jews sought refuge in the bishop's palace, but he told them, "Wretches, your sins have come upon you. You have blasphemed the Son of God and disrespected his mother. This is the cause of your present miseries." Further pogroms in that time occurred in Boppard, Vienna, Speer, Aal, Belitz, Pforzheim, Würzburg, Nuremberg, Alsace, Bavaria, Bohemia, and Moravia. Then became a new poison, expulsion. From 1012 to 1791, 43 expulsion orders were issued banning Jews from cities with states in Europe. First from Mainz in 1012, then Flanders, Bavaria, Paris, France by Louis IX, France by Philip IV, France by Charles IV. From Vienne, Naples, England by Edward I, as Father Alexei mentioned. From Bern, Switzerland, Hungary, France, again by Charles V, Passau, Ravenna, Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492, from Sicily, from Portugal, from Brandenburg, from Naples, from Regensburg, from Bratislava, from Calabria, from the Papal States by Pope Pius V, from Milan, from Frankfurt, from Vienna. In 1683, they were banned from Haiti and other French colonies by the French government. 1744 to 1790, German and Austrian Jews were forced east to Eastern Europe. In 1791, Catherine the Great imposed the Pale of Settlement, restricting Jews to the western and southern parts of the Russian Empire, forbidden to go to Moscow or St. Petersburg. There was an old explanation for why Jews became violinists. Violin was a small instrument, easily portable, and could be taken with them when they had to move. A restricted district was established within which the Jews were required to live in isolation. The word ghetto comes from the Italian word for foundry. The Venice ghetto was built in an industrial area of foundries in 1516. In 1555, Pope Paul IV published a decree ordering Jews be segregated in their own quarter, forbidden to go out at night, barred from all but the meanest occupations, and forced to wear distinctive yellow hats. Ghettos were places in undesirable, filthy, and odorous areas. The Rome ghetto was on the banks of the Tiber, which flooded regularly. It proves how desperate the people were that there were some who took solace in the fact that in the ghetto they had their own area, that they would not be uprooted from there, that it was theirs to develop. That's absolute mark of desperation. One important cause of persecution of Jews was competition among the orders of friars. There were three ways for the orders to compete for power and importance to the Pope: piety, missionary work and conversion, and rooting out heresy. Jews fit the second and third. Pope Innocent III commissioned two new orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans to carry out conversions. Both orders were directed to preach to Jews who were easy to identify and lived close by. King James I of Aragon issued the following order in 1242. We wish and decree that whenever the bishop or the archbishops or Dominicans or Franciscans, friars, visit a town where Saracens or Jews dwell and wish to present the word of God to said Jews or Saracens, they must gather at their call and must patiently hear their preaching. If they do not wish to come of their own free will and accord, our officials can compel them to do so, putting aside all excuses. In 1236, Pope Gregory IX appointed the Franciscans and Dominicans as inquisitors. As official inquisitors, they were authorized to use torture to extract confessions, as approved by Pope Innocent in 1252. The Franciscans were involved in the torture and trials of heretics and witches throughout the Middle Ages and wrote their own manual to guide inquisitors, a far cry from the origins of St. Francis of Assisi. Spain was a unique situation. The Muslims had conquered Spain, coming across from North Africa in 711 and took over the Iberian Peninsula, moved north until they were defeated by Charles Martel in France. And they came back and maintained their control of Spain for 760 years. The Jews were much better treated by the Muslims, much better than the Christian Visigoths, and could live a productive and safe life under the Muslims. For a period of over 300 years under Muslim control, the three peoples of the book lived a productive and peaceful existence together, as has not been done since. It was known as the Convivencia, a period of enlightenment far superior to the darkness of Christian Europe. The contributions of the Muslims in astronomy, medicine, architecture, and mathematics, and their writing of the Greek philosophers came to Europe through the Jews in that time period. The enlightened Umayyad Caliphate of Damascus, who had conquered and ruled Spain, became weak, were outmaneuvered, beaten out by the Berbers of North Africa, who were fundamentalist, the Taliban of their day. They were not educated. They were not interested in education. They wanted their brand of Orthodox Muslim worship to be carried by everyone. Thus ended the Convivencia. The conquest of Iberia by Christian armies, known as the Reconquista, gradually gained control of the entire Iberian Peninsula, ending with the fall of Granada in 1492. In 1492, the expulsion order was issued by Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Those Jews who had converted to Catholicism were expelled. Many Jews who had not converted were expelled. Many Jews settled in next door Portugal, which they were then expelled in 1497 by order of the Pope. Jews were welcomed in Ottoman lands. Sultan Bayezid said of Ferdinand's expulsion of the Jews, "How can you call such a king wise and intelligent? He is making his country poorer and enriching my kingdom." The Netherlands were open to Jews, and the Italian trading cities, Venice and Genoa, also welcomed Jews for their skills in trade. The attempt to forcibly convert Jews in Spain took a different tack than it had in the Rhine areas in the 11th and 12th century. There, the Jews had different choices. They could leave, or they could be baptized and remain secret Jews. The word given for this is marrano, which I'm told in Spanish means swine. So many Jews accepted baptism and remained practicing Jews. This then gave force to the Inquisition to root these people out. There was a book published. Sorry. Then they went, in Spain, they went one step further because the Spaniards did not want competition with the Jews in trade and business, in government administration. They issued the decree that if you had one grandfather who was Jewish, your blood was Jewish blood. Sangria de Lepienza was the faith, the test of blood. And for this reason, many Jews were rooted out. The ones who accepted baptism became the victims of the Inquisition. I like to read cookbooks. I like to cook. I've always found it fascinating. The Spanish cookbooks, Spanish recipes, include shellfish and pork in many dishes of beef and chicken, as no other country does. And I'm sure the reason this was done was to see, since these two foods were forbidden to Jews, when they sat down to eat, did they push it aside? Did they eat it? This was an easy way of identifying somebody, and then off you went. The Spanish Inquisition was established in 1478 to deal with heretical and false Christians. Seville was the main center of Marranos, and there in 1481, the first auto de fe, act of faith, occurred when 6 Jewish men and women were publicly burned at the stake. The auto de fe became frequent public spectacles. To aid in identifying Jews, 37 signs by which one could recognize a Jew were published. One of them was what they ate, as I said before. The Inquisition was extended to the New World, where it continued its dirty work and until officially terminated in 1834. 1492, of course, was Columbus's first voyage, setting sail, and there were some Marranos who connected with the voyage, both in being on the ships and supporting it. Luis de Torres, a converso, a Marrano, was the first European to set foot on soil in the New World. Marranos settled in the New World, and I read a book several years ago about people in New Mexico who were unaware of the reason they lit candles on Friday night. It was a holdover from the days of the Marranos, and their ancestors were Marranos, secret Jews, and all they knew is this is what we do. And there was a book written about these called The Mezuzah and the Madonna's Foot. Mezuzah is a little thing holding the prayers that goes on the door to each house. And there was a wooden Madonna, and they hid the Mezuzah in the Madonna statue. Martin Luther shows an interesting conversion in thought. Conversion is probably a bad word to use in this. Let him speak. His early writings show great respect for Jews and Judaism. In Born a Jew, written in 1523, he said, "Our imbeciles, the papists and bishops, act as if they were dogs, not men. The Jews, the blood relations, the cousins and brothers of our Lord, they belong to Jesus Christ much more than we do. Hence, I beg my dear papists to call me a Jew when they are tired of calling me a heretic." Didn't last long. Martin Luther turned against the Jews in major ways. In 1542, 19 years after Born a Jew, he wrote, "Again the Jews and their lies. Know, O adored Christ, and make no mistake, that aside from the devil, you have no enemy more ravenous, more desperate, more bitter than a true Jew who is truly seeks to be a Jew." In Shem Hamaphra, he wrote that it is easy to convert a Jew as to convert the devil. In short, they are the children of the devil, condemned to the flames of hell. 1542, he wrote concerning the Jews and their lies. When asked what Christians should do with the Jews, he wrote, "First, their synagogues or churches should be set on fire. Second, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmud. Fourth, their rabbis must be forbidden under threat of death to teach anymore. Fifth, traveling privileges should be absolutely forbidden to Jews. Let them stay home. Sixth, they ought to be stopped from usury. Seventh, let the strong Jews and Jewesses be given the flail, the axe, the spade, Moving to Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the Zaporozhye Cossacks were a tribal group living in what is now the Ukraine. They were Eastern Orthodox frontiersmen and led by Bogdan Chmielnicki. They despised the Roman Catholic Poles to their west in Poland, but their real hatred was reserved for the Jews. In 1648, they rose against the Poles, but had special aggression for the Jews. Chmielnicki was a natural genius in warfare, but impulsive and savage. The revolt was brutal, and over 100,000 Jews died in horrible ways. 700 Jewish communities were destroyed in a rampage that is still recalled as one of the darkest times in Jewish history. In the Ukraine, Bogdan Chmielnicki is considered a hero of nationalism, and there are statues of him throughout the Ukraine. The principles of the Enlightenment were distorted to advance anti-Semitism. Frederick the Great of Prussia, who took great pride in being known as the philosopher king, despised Jews, and his 1750 book, General Privileges, was filled with the medieval spirit of anti-Semitism. Voltaire spent his entire life fighting existing abuse and superstitions, yet this enemy of injustice attacked the Jews as a greedy and selfish race whose ideals were more money and more children. Goethe looked upon Jews as inferior and degraded, being Jews should be disinherited politically, restricted economically, and despised socially. It was felt that Christian state was an integral part of the day's political philosophy for which Jews did not fit. In 1824, the Archbishop of Canterbury, said in the House of Lords in opposing a bill to allow Jews to sit in Parliament, quoting, that the blessing of the divine providence had been bestowed upon the country as a Christian country, and we should be apprehensive lest these blessings should be withdrawn when the country ceases to retain its character. Russia was always anti-Semitic from the beginning. In 1504, Ivan III, who was the father of Ivan IV, the Terrible, was in Moscow. Forbid Jews to be in Moscow and Novgorod, and some were burned at the stake there. The Tsarina Elizabeth Petrovna sought to expel all Jews in 1742 when informed of the resulting economic hardships that Russian merchants would suffer. Her answer was, "I do not want any benefit from the enemies of Christ." The Romanovs were strongly anti-Semitic, perhaps because it was their belief, or perhaps because, like all tyrants, they need a scapegoat. More than 1 million Jews were living in Poland in 1772 when Russia annexed major portions of it. These Jews made a majority in some cities and were tradesmen, craftsmen, and professionals, unlike the serfs of Russia. Catherine the Great established the Pale of Settlement, keeping these Jews out of Russia. The Pale confined them to former Poland, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. Tsar Alexander II was hostile to Jews. During his reign, brought sharp deterioration in the Jews' economic, social, and political condition when he restricted their occupations. The Russian imperial police strictly applied the anti-Semite discriminatory laws, and the Russian media involved in unrestrained anti-Semitic propaganda. The Tsar's minister, Pobedonov, stated the aim of the government with regard to the Jews was 1/3 will die out, 1/3 will leave the country, and 1/3 will be completely dissolved in the surrounding population. Pogroms became the official policy of the Russian Empire. The anti-Semitic terror reached its peak in October 1905. Many Jews were attracted by the prospect of liberation of Jewish communities from the conditions imposed by the Russian nobles, as well as disgusted at the political system of the Russian Empire, and these were drawn into radical and reformist ideologies. The Russian Social Democratic Labor Party included many Jews such as Julius Martov and Leon Trotsky. The 19th century brought many changes that re-energized anti-Semitism. There was the rise in nationalism in Europe as new nations were being founded. Germany and Italy became nations. The Balkan states freed themselves from Turkish control. But nationalism brought the cult of patriotism, magnifying hatred of minorities in such atmosphere as Jews were unable to find peace. They were looked upon as an alien group with different religion and culture. They spoke the language, were active in political and economic and intellectual life where permitted, and gave their blood for their country. yet the nationalists did not trust them. In France, in the end of the 19th century, there was a strong French anti-Jewish movement in politics. Edward Drummond published his two-volume Jewish France in 1886, a collection of rumors, myths, and insinuations to prove Jews were peculiar and so different from all others. It was not the first anti-Jewish book, but it was the first to become a bestseller, selling over 100,000 copies and reprinted 200 times. In 1894, the maid in the German embassy in Paris was actually a French spy, and searched through a trash can in the office of the ambassador and found a list of certain documents belonging to the French General Staff, which were offered for sale. When this was taken back to the General Staff, right away pinned the blame on Alfred Dreyfus, the only Jew in the General Staff, a captain, a man who had no motive and did his job. They forged documents indicting him. They brought in witnesses, anonymous witnesses that were not allowed to be interviewed by the defense. And in a closed trial, they found him guilty of treason. He was publicly broken at a ceremony at the French General Staff courtyard, in which the insignias were stripped from his tunic and his sword was broken. The crowd, watching this from the outside, screamed, "Death to Dreyfus! Death to the Jews!" Well, a colonel on the French General Staff, Picard, came across absolute proof that it was not Dreyfus, but Major Ferdinand Esterhazy, who was the spy, because he lived high off the hog and he needed money. He took the documents to the French General Staff and they told him to shut up, and they sent him out of the country. Eventually, the French intelligentsia got on this, and Georges Clemenceau, who was to become the prime minister, and Émile Zola, the author, tried their best to defend Dreyfus. Zola published the famous letter, "I Accuse," in a newspaper in which he accused very specific charges against members of the French General Staff in forging and manipulating the fate of Alfred Dreyfus. Dreyfus was recalled from Devil's Island, was given a second trial. They found him guilty again, but this time the sentence was not imposed. The French General Staff made the argument that the integrity of the French General Staff, their honor, depended upon keeping Dreyfus in Devil's Island. This is the same French General Staff that got walked over 15 years later when the Germans invaded. During the breaking ceremony of Dreyfus, there was a Swiss journalist named Theodor Herzl who witnessed it. He saw the people screaming, "Death to Dreyfus, death to the Jews." Knowing also the problems of the Jews in Germany, in Eastern Europe, he came to the conclusion that Jews were not safe in Europe. He then began the political movement to return to the homeland of Palestine, also known as Zionism. Now we got to Germany. Wilhelm Marr's The Victory of Judaism Over Germany became the anti-Semites textbook, along with Glogau's The Bourse and the swindles in Berlin, denigrating the Jews involved in finance. At the same time, Bismarck was a political battle with the Catholics, the National, and the Socialists. He invoked the traditional cry of blaming the Jews to use them as a scapegoat. In 1892, centrist and conservative combined and issued a policy statement. We combat the oppressive and disintegrating Jewish influence on our nation's life. We demand our Christian people a Christian magistracy, a Christian teachers for Christian peoples. Richard Wagner said, emancipation from the yoke of Judaism appears to us to be the foremost necessity. And Adolf Streicher, who was a favorite of Hitler, wrote, the Jews were exploitive and capitalist. World War I saw 100,000 Jews serve in the German army, incurring 13,000 casualties. Yet during the 1920s, public forums against the Jews were frequent in towns and universities. The leaders of the defeated Second Reich promoted the myth of a Jewish conspiracy as General Ludendorff blamed Germany's defeat on World War I on the Jews. And we come to the Holocaust, which is beyond words. Joseph Stalin, who along with Hitler murdered the most people of anybody in history, and he made the famous statement that the murder of one man is excuse me, I know that one. The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. And that's the way things went. Laws were passed throughout the 1930s to continually remove the rights of Jews. They were removed from public service, forbidden from taking exams, kosher slaughter was outlawed, restricted Jewish students were in public schools, Jews lose German citizenship, Jews banned from editorial positions, Jewish actors forbidden in plays and films. In 1935, outlawed Jewish officers in the German army. The Nuremberg laws defined a person to be a Jew if one grandparent is Jewish. Jews can't vote, reduce Jewish business by 2/3, forbid marriage or sex with a non-Jew. 1936, Jews forbidden to be tax consultants, Jews banned from veterinary practice. I don't know who you're going to hurt as a veterinary, but banned Jewish teachers from public schools. 1938, the Evian Conference came when the Germans asked the neighbors in Europe to take their Jews. They wanted to get rid of them. Nobody took anything. They had to remain in Germany. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, in which the German government murders 91 Jews, sends 30,000 to concentration camps, burns 267 synagogues, and 7,500 Jewish businesses were looted. Nobody stood up for the Jews. Nobody anywhere in this. Not in Europe, not the Americans. Hitler, well, I guess I can do this. I can do whatever I want. Nobody is standing against me. And Jews have learned a lesson from all this, that we are dependent upon ourselves. During the occupation in World War II, the French and the Italian governments turned their Jewish citizens in to the Germans. Well, the Danes protected their Jewish citizens. They said they were Danes first, and they were protected. The final pogrom until October the 7th occurred in Europe July the 4th, 1946, 100 years after the end a year after the end of the war. A young boy had been missing for 2 days. He finally appeared. He later confessed that he'd gone to stay with a friend in the country. And then he's walking along with his father in the town of Kielce, and he points to a house and says, "That's where they kept me." And that man was the one who imprisoned me. The father got the police. They came in, shot a bunch of... This house was full of survivors from the Holocaust. They shot a bunch. People in a foundry got alerted. 600 of them came and beat the rest of them to death with iron cord pipes. And this was 1946. I think I will stop at that point. Wish I had something nice to say. It doesn't exist. I think we have time. Where's Jonathan? With time for some question and answers, if you'd like to. Give Jonathan a chance to get the mic set up.
Test. There we are. Yes, Jerry.
I have two questions. Question number one, you gave accuse. You gave a good accusation against the church for the foundations of anti-Semitism and brought it to the Protestant church. Here we are, 2024, we have severe anti-Semitism. What's the church doing today? And what's been done since 1965 actively by the church to combat anti-Semitism? And the second question I have is I've always been curious why the church never talked history about Jesus. He was born in Judea. A lot of my Catholic friends were very taught about Catholicism, but they don't know anything about what really was going on in Judea at the time of Jesus. They never heard of the Jewish wars against Rome. They never knew who really controlled it. The fact that the Jews crucified Jesus was an incredible accusation, since the Jews never had the power to crucify anybody. So I've often wondered why the church doesn't teach hardcore history.
We'll try to answer the second question first. I think that since 1965, since this Vatican Council, Catholic teaching has changed, and our emphasis certainly has changed. I have a friend who teaches at Georgetown University, and it was, I think, an interreligious class. And the first day of class, he wrote on the whiteboard, now they call them, Jesus was a Jew. This is a Catholic priest teaching. Jesus was a Jew. And a young woman stood up and said, "Oh, no, he wasn't. He was a Christian." It shows that we have a lot of work to do. But we're trying to do it. And the first question, I think that the church, Christianity as a whole, has a lot to answer for as contributing towards the buildup of the Holocaust and such. And I think, again, next week, you asked what is the church doing since then. That's going to be the focus of our remarks next week.
Hi, my name's Melissa Tumim, and so I'm going to pose a theory to you and get your opinion on it. My theory of why the church demonized the Jews was because the Roman Church couldn't take responsibility for having killed their own God. Would that make sense to you?
If I understood your question correctly, we couldn't take responsibility for killing our own God?
Right. If Jesus was God, then there's the second part. If Jesus was the Roman God, as embraced by Constantine, as embraced by Constantine, then if obviously the Romans killed Jesus because the Romans were in control, but the Romans needed to slough off blame to somebody else. They couldn't take responsibility for having killed the head of the founder of their church, right?
Yeah, I think that there's Christianity. I hesitate to speak for all of Christianity here because we have a Methodist pastor standing right here, and we're in his church. But certainly Catholicism would say that Christ voluntarily accepts his death on the cross, which was initiated at the hands or facilitated at the hands of the Romans. Certainly the Jews didn't have the authority to execute people. That's not to say that in the Christian scriptures that the leaders of the Jewish people didn't agitate for this. But as we'll see next week, the decree Nostra Aetate of the Second Vatican Council clearly states that we cannot blame every Jew for the responsibility of killing Jesus. Jews living then, Jews living now, or Jews living in the future. Absolutely not.
And the other theory that I have as to why anti-Semitism exists, and this I pose to both of you, is rooted in the 4 questions from the Passover Seder. Now, the youngest child of school age is tasked during the Seder to challenge the head of the household, not once, not twice, but 4 times. Explain yourself. Manashtana halayla hazeh. Why are we doing things differently tonight? And that child learns to be a critical thinker and learns that they have a duty to question authority. So consequently, Jews make bad slaves, bad followers. So if you are a tyrant, if you are a monarch, then having Jews under your control, well, that's going to be an unruly population. That's going to be a population that's harder to control. So I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not sure I followed quite everything you said there, but I think that I'd have to think about that, okay? I'd have to think about that.
Jews are raised to ask questions. We question our clergy, we question our parents, we question our teachers. We want to understand more. This is the way you learn. I once heard a lecture by a Nobel laureate physicist who said that when he came home from school in his early years, his mother would not say, "What did you learn?" She said, "What questions did you ask of your teacher?" This is our nature. This is the way we are. This is the way we're brought up. And one other thing, going back to the Jerusalem and Jesus, when you see the movie or you read about Jesus comes to Jerusalem and it's, "Hey, Hosanna, Hosanna," and everybody's out there welcoming. And when Pilate is trying him, it's, "Crucify him, crucify him." Those are the same people. They can't do both, friends. They can't do both. And this is part of anti-Semitism. Opposites are combined in ways that are completely illogical. Talmud is a book of law. Talmud is a book of Jews were very conscious of their obligation to Torah and to the laws of Torah, the Orthodox Jews, and for most of Jewish history, all Jews were Orthodox Jews. So the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is the written law, but it only goes so far. It's like having something that says, drive safely. And then you go out and you start up traffic lights and you put up lanes and you put up things, stop signs to enforce that. That's the Talmud. The Talmud is educated patriarchs sitting around and refining the law so that it could actually be used, because Torah is hard to follow a lot of that and it doesn't go very far. I personally think the rabbis went too far, because they take things out of there and that, well, maybe we should do it this and we should do this. And I think they get carried away with their authority to some degree. The idea of keeping milk and meat separate in a kosher home comes from one line in the Torah that says you not see the kid in its mother's milk. And from that, they extrapolate and extrapolate and extrapolate. But Jews did have their own legal system. And within the ghettos, their legal system was enforced by their patriarchs. And the Talmud was what expanded the Torah so that it became a practical document. It is case law. That's really what it is.
Yes, another question, just a second.
Thank you. My name is Sandy Behrens, and I have a comment and a question. My comment is that I'm a Lutheran, so we've always been taught that Christ's death was a fulfillment of the Old Testament. So, there's no blame here. I mean, this was God's plan, right? And he's just that was just fulfilling what God promised us in the Old Testament. So that's my comment. My question is probably very trivial, but I just want to know what the difference is between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism.
I didn't get it. Did you?
What's the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism?
Nothing. It is the term. A Semite technically could be a number of Middle Eastern people, but it's only used about Jews. Anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic are the same.
Yes, Father Alexei mentioned a shift at one point from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism. And I took that to mean that the church's posture with regard to another religious community being different from one another versus the demonizing of the persons of that community as unworthy. Is that a fair?
That's fair. Also, the idea of being anti-Jewish beliefs and Jewish worship styles, and anti-Jews, period. Okay? There was a shift there between from the church's position from being against Jewish worship and Jewish beliefs as opposed to being just against Jewish people.
It's something you need to understand. Jews are unique as a people in the world because there is the religion, and there is the culture. Can you go out and do a Methodist dance? You can certainly know what a Jewish dance is. You go out and you eat Catholic food? No, but you eat Jewish food. The culture is all bound around the religion because there's so many rules for following the religion if you were an Orthodox person. So the distinction between the religion and the group really fades because Jews are culturally connected as well as being religiously connected, and more are culturally connected. We have such a thing as dietary Jews, people who will eat corned beef and pastrami and things like that and not go to synagogue. but they're Jews. The definition of a Jew is one whose mother was a Jew, or one who converts under an approved circumstance.
My name's Don Hughes. I have a question. There's a war in the Middle East. Palestinians, which are controlled, my understanding, by Hamas, who says that their mantra is to destroy Israel. Israel is fighting the Hamas. Hamas are Muslims. Earlier you said the Jews got better treatment from the Muslims than they did from the Christians. The U.S. is primarily a Christian country defending Israel in this war. So I'd like to understand.
What I said was Jews were treated better under Muslim rule than under Christian rule.
But
That was my statement. Christians were also treated the same as Jews under Muslim rule.
Okay, fine. But I guess what I'm trying to understand is, do you feel that the war between Israel and Hamas is anti-Semitism, or is it because the Jews have taken over the Palestinians' homeland?
That is a very long answer to that, and you have to go through a great deal. It's not a simple thing to expand. The next lecture, I will get into Israel and into modern times, and I would prefer you to ask that question at that time, because it's not, when Hamas says from the river to the sea, they want to kill every Jew between them. They don't want anybody left. They want to control it. That's what their position is.
Another question over here, Larry.
Larry Russell. Since time began, have been fighting with anti-Semitism and all that stuff, why do we think we can control it now? What if we can't change it? Why don't we just go on the way it's been forever?
What's the question?
I'm sorry, it's difficult to hear.
Given our history, what is the likelihood that we're ever going to do any better than we have?
Given our history, what?
Given our history of anti-Semitism, what's the likelihood that we will ever do any better than we have?
I'm still not getting it. It's hard to hear.
What chances do we have of being better?
It requires leadership. Nothing can happen without strong and dedicated leadership to improve all this on both sides. Make no doubt about it, the leadership on both sides is lacking the strength to stand for principles. The modern day understand one of the problems Israel has is they have no constitution. That means that laws are made all the time, and the court can reject them as being illegal, but there's no standard there. And because there's so many political parties in Israel, they put coalitions together that are absurd, and that's what it is right now. I will tell you, next lecture when I talk about Israel, I strongly disagree with many of the positions of the government of Israel. I strongly disagree with many of the positions of the government of the United States. And I will explain to you next time why Israel is important to me.
Thank you, Bob. I think I would like to add, and I'm not trying to pat this congregation or United Methodism on the back, because we are as complicit at a local level in perpetuating injustice as any community of persons is. But sharing facilities for 7 years was an awakening experience for this congregation. And the bond that was built between this church and Ner Tamid, though hardly anyone from either congregation is with us still who experienced that. The sense of relationship persists. We also seek to engage, as with Dawn Unity, but with other interfaith efforts, to bring persons together out of different religious communities so that we may look one another in the eye and that we may have conversations that are respectful and hopeful. I see Saradine here, who's been a part of bringing those kinds of events to this campus in an interfaith basis here in the South Bay with Jewish, Christian, Muslim youth. When we know each other as human beings, it is harder for us to maintain the frauds and the falsehoods that have been passed on to us. I do want to hold out the hope that there is a way forward for us. But Bob, I'm going to agree with you that it takes leadership and courage. And I don't mean just at the hierarchy, I mean among us.
Let me add a personal note to what Jonathan just said. Many of you knew I grew up near the buckle of the Bible Belt. I was the only Jew in my high school. I was in a town of 25,000 with a population of 25 Jewish families. I was called a Christ killer before I knew what either word was. But one of the advantages of living in an environment like that is that you learn to pick the good from the bad people. And here, I have not run across any bad people in this area, and I've run across a lot of good people. But in Rome, Georgia, there were some of each.
I want to encourage you to gather with us a week from Thursday at St. Francis Episcopal Church for a second part to the conversation. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Alexei. Thank you, Bob.